Hello and welcome to this short screencast on chapter 1 of The Great Gatsby. Um, in fact, it's on the very first paragraph of the first chapter of The Great Gatsby. Um, but before we start looking at the text itself, you should hopefully know by now that our narrator is called Nick Carraway, and therefore, as it's Nick's narrative perspective that we're looking at, his name, the character's name, actually bears some scrutiny here. Um, the word Carraway, albeit a slightly different spelling, is another name for a seed, and that's significant, I think, given that to an extent Nick is the seed from which this novel grows. He is our starting point. He is our kind of source, our source of information about the rest of the characters and the story. I guess the only other thing to say about this, though, is that a caraway is apparently a fairly common seed, widely used, as you can see there from that definition, which again also might tell us something about Nick's character, perhaps. So on to the first paragraph. And this famous opening line: "In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since." And I wanted to start by focusing on those three words there: more vulnerable years. Here, by reflecting on his younger years where Nick feels he was more vulnerable, that implies that he is now less vulnerable, he's more experienced, he lacks vulnerability at this point in his life. By talking about when he was more vulnerable, he implies that he's now less vulnerable. And so I wondered if it was sensible at this point to ask the question, should we as readers therefore actually trust him more if he tells us that he's now less vulnerable? Moving on, we quickly get this quotation from Nick's father: "Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had." And this immediately provides us some sense of social context. Nick's social status is foregrounded here. It's right at the very front of the novel. It's made overt. We know from the very first page that he's had quite a fortunate upbringing. As such, this also serves to suggest that social class will be a prominent theme in the novel. It's already a prominent theme, on the first page. I then wanted to move on to this really interesting phrase talking about his relationship with his father. Nick says that they are unusually communicative in a reserved way. Now, for me, this is a juxtaposition of two different kind of ideas, two ideas that wouldn't necessarily normally sit together. The idea of being communicative, but also of being reserved. This juxtaposition captures Nick's relationship with his father in a really succinct and quite a poetic way. It's subtle, it's understated, yet it's clear. I think we all know what he means by that. We might have relationships like that where we don't necessarily have to say a lot in order to be understood by a certain person, a friend or a parent or a family member. Next, I'm interested in this. So a bit further on, Nick uses this phrase here, veteran bores. And for me, this was something of an irony, quite a knowing irony here. I think Nick knows what he's doing. But in a passage where Nick is essentially claiming to reserve judgments, ironically here, he's being really judgmental. He's revealing that these people that he's referring to are tremendously boring, okay, that he's been the victim of these veteran bores. As such, by kind of letting us in on this irony that someone who claims not to be judgmental actually is being really judgmental, Nick's establishing quite a close and intimate relationship with us, with the readers, by letting us in on this judgment of others. And in many ways, that sets the tone for his relationship with us for the rest of the novel. Okay, moving on, and following on from this sense that Nick, as a narrator, is a trustworthy confidant, that he is someone that we can trust, we've got this phrase here that Nick was privy to the secret griefs of wild unknown men. Here, Nick, who we need to trust as our narrator, or we're being invited to trust, claims that many people, even unknown people, tell him their secrets. As such, perhaps he's inviting us to believe the story he's about to tell us, because he's basically saying he's an insider. He knows everyone's secrets. We can trust him to give us an interesting and reliable account, perhaps. Following on from this phrase, but also picking up on this word men elsewhere in this section, we have this repetition of the word men and of other masculine kind of pronouns. We've got he several times, and obviously those references to his father. This opening section is dominated by men and masculine references. His father, the men who confide in him, perhaps suggesting that this novel will be an exploration of men and masculinity. Ultimately, maybe, that's what Fitzgerald is interested in. It's also noteworthy, and you can draw your own conclusions from this, but Nick here is revealing to us that he keeps the company of men who are A, wild, and B, unknown to him. So that perhaps gives us some sort of insight into the experiences that Nick has had. Next, I just wanted to pick up on this word plagiaristic, and as a student we hope that you're never guilty of this, of being a plagiarist, because it means that you're someone who basically just copies other people's work. In this context, plagiaristic is about copying, but perhaps more generally about lacking originality. Again, Nick here is being quite condescending about the people he's describing, the idea that they lack originality. He feels that even when people are revealing secrets and expressing their emotions, they're being quite boring. They're lacking originality in the ways that they do it. As readers, we therefore know that Nick will not shy away from blending his own opinions and his judgments into his narration, because he can be quite scathing. He can be really quite judgmental. Which, ironically and quite neatly, takes me on to this next highlighted passage. This declarative, Nick declares, reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. This short declarative reflects that Fitzgerald, through Nick, is inclined to include thought-provoking, poetic, even philosophical ideas into his narrative. Perhaps this idea provides relief from Nick's previously cynical tone, that hope can be found through reserving judgments. It's difficult to judge this because Nick is quite ironic. He is quite sort of cynical in this opening passage. That whether or not we believe that he actually does find hope or infinite hope through reserving judgments is a matter for some debate. But for me, I think that it is perhaps a glimmer of sincerity in amongst the rather more kind of condescending and cynical elements of this section. Moving on then towards the bottom of this opening paragraph, we have an example of sibilance. Sibilance is where you get a repeated kind of S sound. We have this phrase, snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat. Here, I suggest that Nick is snarling and sneering, using these hissing S sounds as he reflects on his own and his father's snobbishness. This is important because it reflects that despite his cynicism and his inclination to judge others, Nick can also be self-deprecating. He can also kind of share harsh judgments of himself, slightly make fun of himself to a degree. And remember, he's doing this on page 1. He's doing this in his opening paragraph, so he's really reaching out to us as readers and maybe saying, look, okay, I'm being judgmental, but I'm actually also being judgmental about myself. The last thing to bring to your attention in this close reading is the last 3 words here, unequally at birth, which again is another example of social context. Again, Nick is being direct and clear in his desire to address social status and social inequality. by highlighting how decencies are unequally parcelled out at birth. Perhaps he's also reflecting on how more material things like money and possessions are similarly distributed. There's not a level playing field out there. Some people are born with money and material goods, and others are not. And this will prove to be a significant theme, a significant idea throughout the rest of the novel. Okay, so for the next few seconds, I'm going to give you something of a recap. I'm just going to put these slides up on the screen, which gives you the narrative features and language devices that I've been talking to you about with some explanation of their effect. I'm going to put these on screen for a few seconds. It's going to be your job really to hit pause on any slides, on any of this information that's useful to you, and at which point you might want to make notes or annotate your own copy of the novel. So that's plenty of time there for the first one. And the second. The third. And the final slide there. So that covers all of the close readings that I've tried to provide. And finally, I'd just like to leave you with 3 things to consider from this opening section. Firstly, I'd like you to think about, as a reader, do we want a narrator who reserves judgments? That opening section has been all about that idea of reserving judgment. Think about other books you've read and think about how the narrative voice operates. Have you read lots of very judgmental narrators or very quite objective narrators? Secondly, as you read on, ask yourself who or what provides Nick with the kind of infinite hope he refers to on page 1. I think Nick does have epiphanies, or at least one epiphany about what's going on in this novel. So ask yourself where that comes from. And finally, think about the fact that the novel begins with a reference to Nick's father, and as you read to the end of the novel, trace the portrayal of other fathers. What about how Tom behaves as a father? How about when we meet Gatsby's father right at the end of the novel? Think about those things in the narrative too. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope it was useful, and look out for other similar screencasts coming out in the near future. Bye.